Every fighter has limitations, and sometimes that's what makes them compelling. Knowing that their style is constrained within a set of consistent parameters gives you an easy entryway into discussing that fighter's strengths and weaknesses. Enter Chris Curtis. The heavy-handed southpaw fought everywhere prior to securing his first contract with the UFC back in 2021. Upon making his UFC debut against Phil Hawes, it was immediately apparent that he had a few attributes which would make him a tough out against any competitor in the middleweight division. His tight high guard and shoulder roll meant he wasn't always particularly easy to hit. His insistence on left hooks and kicks to the body meant Hawes had to constantly readjust his defense. And of course, his timing with both his left hand and his lead hook was solid, but mainly his left hook in this instance. After 3 back-to-back-to-back victories in a row, Curtis was starting to make some noise in the division, and as a reward, Curtis was given a chance to compete against number 8 ranked middleweight Jack Hermansson on short notice, replacing Darren Till. For those unaware, Hermansson is a frustrating guy. He comes from a Greco-Roman wrestling background, so his body lock takedowns are solid, but his shots from afar are often a little lacking. He has a great modified arm in guillotine that he's hit against solid guys like Gerald Meerschaert and David Branch, but he struggles to get guys down to use it. He's a cardio machine with awkward fundamentals who typically struggles when he gets hit with anything powerful. This matchup looked like a cakewalk for the Action Man when it was first announced. The Reddit thread announcing the opponent change felt more like an open obituary for Hermansson than anything else. Everyone was focusing on how Jack isn't particularly effective with his takedowns in open space, and Chris Curtis has great takedown defense. But everyone here failed to acknowledge something bigger than takedown defense or offense. Can Chris Curtis turn right? It seems like a pretty basic concept, particularly as a southpaw. Opponent moves away from your power hand, you've got to find a way to line them back up and hit them with that weapon. We call this cage cutting. As it turned out, Chris Curtis couldn't really do that. Hermansson came out swinging with a lot of his usual looks. Step up low kicks, awkward dips and slips off of the jab, and body kicks on the open side. Movement in both directions and variation in attack. But there's a point in the first round where Hermansson realizes that all he needs to do is land a shot or two, move off to his left, and bring his shoulder up to mitigate the risk of the right hook. Chris then typically jogs after him and the cycle repeats. Now, before we go on, we have talked about effective cage cutting before and how some fighters are notoriously bad at it. One of my earlier videos was on Holly Holm vs Irene Aldana, and how Aldana, in a southpaw versus orthodox matchup no less, couldn't get Holm in front of her to hit. Holm kept circling away from her power hand, and Aldana just followed her around, instead of cutting her trajectory off. It's worth noting the distinction between that performance and this one. Chris Curtis can cage cut, and you see it plenty in this fight. Here, after Hermansson gets past the lead foot and starts circling off, Curtis moves diagonally to keep himself in front of Hermansson and to prevent Hermansson from returning to the center of the cage. As such, he is, by definition, successfully cage cutting. Why doesn't it work then? Well, it's because Curtis doesn't capitalize on cutting the cage. He gets Hermansson back in front of him, stops in his place instead of initiating offense, and then gives Hermansson another opportunity to step around the lead foot. Compare that to Robbie Lawler here. Condit is trying to move to his left to get past Robbie's lead foot. Robbie will step across with the right foot to cut off that angle whilst throwing the left hand. The cagecraft helps service the offense. It happens again here when Condit is moving along the cage. From this still image, it looks like Condit should be able to get away from the left hand. But if we roll the footage, we find that Robbie brings his lead foot across diagonally to put him in range to land. He then cuts across again to initiate the 3-2. Chris, in comparison, is a bit too patient. He cuts across and then sits in front of Jack, waiting for a countering opportunity. But he keeps acting on that opportunity after Jack has already moved around the lead foot. Chris gets so frustrated about it that he starts taunting Jack, like here. Keep in mind that this is almost directly after Hermansson had just hurt Chris with a high kick and split the guard with a flurry of elbows against the cage. So if his issue is with inactivity, the only person he has to blame here is himself. The entire third round is filled with this kind of behaviour. Here, Curtis is constantly cutting but never throws. No intercepting right hooks after cutting across to beat the lead foot or extending long with a straight left. He tries using the right hook here, but half-heartedly, doing damage only to Jack's tricep. The funniest moment of the fight is when Hermansson does what Chris wants. He stands in front of him for a full 5 seconds. Then when Chris starts to move forward, Jack pops his head with 3 jabs, and then direction changes to the left to get outside Curtis's lead foot and circle away. Instead of cutting the cage, Chris opts to call for Hermansson to meet him in the middle and exchange, despite having done absolutely nothing when given the opportunity to do exactly that 10 seconds ago. And then Jack lowline side kicks him. That is a quality troll job from our favourite Swedish-Norwegian fighter. Predictably, Hermansson won a unanimous decision, much to Curtis's irritation. But the only person he has to blame is himself, really. Remember, if you find yourself frustrated during a fight or a sparring session because you can't seem to keep your opponent or sparring partner in front of you, before blaming them, think, could you be doing something to force engagements, even if it means going outside of your usual stylistic inclinations? 9 times out of 10, the answer is yes, you could. Go back, watch the footage, and make the adjustment.